Okay, test. Looks like that's working. All right, yeah. Let's make sure this is working. Oops. PowerPoint. There we go. Check. What time is it? Oh, there you go. Check. Oh, you can hear me now. There we go. All right, welcome everybody to the October meeting of the Hamilton Naturalists Club Bird Study Group.
Can we leave early for the baseball game?
Yeah, apparently there's a game going on tonight. So I'll try to be quick. Yeah, it's a bird club, so there we go. So here's a little bit about what tonight looks like. We're going to talk about what we are as a group, what we're doing here, sightings that have occurred so far this autumn, a little bit of bird advocacy, a little tiny bit about the Christmas bird count coming up, and upcoming events, and then on to our speaker for the evening. And I haven't really mentioned this much in the last year, but we have been live streaming our meetings for a year now, I believe it is. In the past, we had done we recorded in the building and then posted it on YouTube, or did a Zoom and then posted it on YouTube. But now we stream it direct there, and then we don't have to edit it after. It's just there the whole time. And so just so you're aware, that is a thing. And there's probably a few people who are watching a certain baseball game and have this tabbed up as well too, maybe, So, but you know what? We're not the only naturalist club on YouTube, and that's what I found fascinating, is that if you want to look for all kinds of speakers and stuff, there are groups around the world who do this, and I thought it would be fun each month to just kind of point out at least one of them. Here's one that I came across today, the Trinidad and Tobago Field Naturalist Club, which is 28 years older than us. Like, our club started in 1919. They started in 1891. And they post their latest videos about sea turtles and presentations like that, which are really neat. They don't live stream them, but they do like we used to do, record them and then upload them. So that's something you can go take a look at. And the other nice thing about us live streaming this and it going to YouTube is if you afterwards are like, oh, what was that thing that person said? You can just go look it up or see a slide. So a little bit about us. The Hamilton Naturalist Club, as I mentioned before, we've been protecting nature since 1919. So we're dedicated to the study, appreciation, conservation of wild plants and animals. And all of our meetings and field events are open to everyone. Membership is not required. However, becoming a member, you will get our monthly journal, The Wood Duck, and be supporting our mission to protect nature in the Hamilton study area. And that study area is within this circle here. It encompasses the entireties of Hamilton and Burlington, the towns of Milton, Grimsby, and Oakville, and the reserves of Six Nations, the Grand River and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and a good chunk of the city of Brantford. And also a few other smaller towns and municipalities in part as well too. These lands have been the traditional territories of various indigenous peoples, such as the Erie peoples, the Adirondack, the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas. The treaty agreements within our study area include the Between the Lakes Treaty, Brant Tract, Head of the Lake Purchase, the Adjacents Treaty, and the Treaties 22 and 23. These were agreements between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, which they currently reside just north of Hangersville. Additionally, these lands were covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Within all that, the Hamilton Naturalist Club is steward of 11 nature sanctuaries. Some of them are actually technically outside of the Hamilton study area, but it's all right. One of their newest ones is Pine Hill, which is in the Dundas Valley. So you can go look at our website and see all about that, or in the appropriate issue of the Wood Duck. I'm sure it's been featured by now. We encourage our community members to consider what they might be able to do to support all new birders and naturalists in any way they can. We live in an era where nature is constantly under threat, but the tools available to connect anyone to nature are continuously becoming more accessible. So growing the naturalist and birding communities through personal encouragement and support I think that can help us to protect what remains and, in time, help us reclaim what has been lost so far. And beyond just becoming a member of the club, we're always welcome discussions about joining the board or volunteering with habitat restoration, which can include invasives removal, trail maintenance, lots of other stuff. You can email volunteer@hamiltonnature.org to find out more there. You could write for the Wood Duck, our journal. We're always looking for photos and articles and all that kind of stuff. You could lead a field event. You don't need to be an expert. You just need to be able to kind of keep a group together and find the expertise within the group on where you're exploring. You can also online join our Discord server where you can ask questions, share sightings, and help us build our online presence. There's a link there that you can use to join. And you can go there and also ask us about the Ontario Rare Bird Alert Discord. They don't have as easy of a URL to share, but you can come just ask us. That's a place where a lot of people find out about the rare birds in the area. And here, I usually put this slide at the end, but then we never get to the end because I always put it on the after the speaker part. And by the time we're done the speaker, we're usually not going to set up the next PowerPoint again. So I figured I'd share this now here, is that we are on Instagram and Blue Sky and obviously YouTube, which I mentioned before. And a little bit about our club's goals, or at least our bird study group goals, I should say, to keep our minds on the birds beyond just what we see and hear in the field, to allow for broader conversation about bird ecology, threats, efforts, trends, predictions, bring awareness and amplify efforts, initiatives, projects that are having a positive impact, and to bring the average person and the expert birder into the same space. Now that said, let's get into a little bit of the birds that have been seen this autumn. Here's our bird of the month that I've selected, and the reason I've selected this might be pretty obvious, but it has stuck around a long, long time, and a lot of people gotten to see it, and I think that's worth a lot right there, let alone how rare it is for us to get a red phalarope around here. This is in Valley Inn, Carroll's Point, found originally by Cody Bassendale and photographed by Rick Lauzon, which I pulled this off of eBird. There was actually another super rare bird, and I'll get into that in a moment, not much more rare than this, but there's a whole bunch of birds that have happened in the last month or so. One of those you'll see at the top of the list with several exclamation points is a gray kingbird, which was a one morning wonder. One person got a photo, didn't realize what they had, and then later realized what they had, kind of thing. One of those stories. Really exciting find. But other than that, we've had things such as Acadian flycatcher, American white pelicans, that kingbird, that red phalarope. There were black-bellied plover in Bronte Beach, stilt sandpiper, and Wilson's phalarope in Binbrook, CA. Nelson sparrow made their return again, this time to the Desjardins Canal, somewhere that actually could be accessed properly, so they actually did kind of show up somewhere people could see them. There was Ross's goose and then later snow goose show up just north of Whaley's Corners in Halton. White-eyed vireo, I think there was actually a couple reports, but one of them was Woodland Cemetery. Oakville had an American golden plover. A northern shrike, even though not rare, I still count it as notable to have it fairly early and hanging around Salt Fleet Conservation Area. Barn swallow, a couple different people spotted that one. It was hanging out with a red phalarope. Black-legged kittiwake and parasitic yager, both at Sioux Lookout in Burlington. Golden eagle flying over at Bayfront Park. Philadelphia vireo was a recent report on the Harrisburg Rail Trail. Yellow-bellied flycatcher at Confederation. Purple martin at 50 Point. Red-throated loon at Van Wagner's. A couple warblers, a morning warbler and Canada warbler, are a little late comers at Guelph Arboretum. And just today, hot off the presses, a California gull was at Van Wagner's Beach today, apparently. So that's a very fresh report right there. And now we're going to talk a little bit about bird advocacy. So the Hamilton Children's Museum at Gage Park has now been treated with bird-friendly markers. These are the little sticker kind of marker things that go over glass to prevent birds from flying right into them. And we have a picture here with Barry Coombs, who's with Birdsong Hamilton and Flap Canada, presenting Carolyn here, Carolyn Samko. who took the initiative to do this. She's from the city of Hamilton. She personally took the initiative to have this done. And so she's been presented with this certificate of appreciation for that. And also, Bird Friendly Hamilton Burlington team reported on Facebook that working with Councillor Narinder Nan, the Ward 3 office, and the city's manager of forestry and horticulture, the south sides of Gage Park Greenhouse have been treated also with bird-friendly markers. So Gage Park, much more bird-friendly now, and hopefully there'll be more facades to follow there. Also, just one more thing, and this is from, I believe, today. There's an important article in the Hamilton Spectator about keeping cats indoors, and yeah, I think most people here know about that, but it's always good to reemphasize to try to keep your cats indoors, because they do contribute largely to mortality in birds. A little bit about Christmas bird counts, since the season's coming soon. We manage 3 counts within the HSA, the Hamilton and the Flamborough and the Peachtree Christmas bird counts, and we can always use some help with those. That kind of help. I don't just mean counters, because we always got lots of counters, and it's great. We got such a huge count. It's kind of like, it's amazing, but then it's also more difficult to manage because we have so many counters. So especially in Hamilton, we get 100 plus people, and that could be a lot of emailing back and forth to try to get someone to make sure you get zone assignments set out so people aren't overlapping and things like that, and people who are new to the count who want to join someone who's old to the count so that they kind of get to learn what they're doing. So that kind of email correspondence we could always use some help with if somebody wanted to help us with that. So connecting like zone leaders with other counters who want to join in to help promote the count within the birding community as well, if somebody wanted to help with that. And one of the ones I'm just emphasizing here, because this is one I've always wanted to see if we could get a separate coordinator for, almost, especially with the Hamilton count specifically, because the Hamilton count is largely urban. The Flamborough one is entirely rural. The Peachtree one is kind of a mix of both. The Hamilton one is pretty much all urban, and there are so many bird feeders in there, but we get like 2 or 3 people that sign up to do the feeder counts, and that's about it. And I'd imagine it could be an interesting coordinator, volunteer position for someone to be like, let's just organize a kind of almost separate counter or a feeder count, as it were. It would still follow the rules and have to be in the same day, and it would have to be within the circle. But, they would talk with a different coordinator, because then, you could centralize all that data into that one person and not have to worry too much about mixing with, assigning groups and things like that. Anyways, if anybody's interested in that, please let me know, because we get very small numbers of people reporting the number of hours that they are at feeders and things like that. So we end up, I feel like we end up with lower numbers in part due to that. So it'd be nice to have something for that. Also, there's a lot of people who would like to just sit at home and do family things on Boxing Day, and that's typically the Hamilton Christmas bird count day. So we also have upcoming the WELO KBA surveys. Used to be known as an IBA, now KBA is the key term now. And that KBA, it used to be IBA, important bird area. That is kind of being slowly phased out into key biodiversity areas instead. Less exclusive to birds and more just in general biological diversity, essentially. But it's still, the west end of Lake Ontario is still the core focus of this count. It takes place, this survey, on the second Saturday each month, November through April. So you can contact Chris Motherwell at that email address there. And there's 17 areas. They range from the west of Dixie Road down to the western Niagara-on-the-Lake. So basically from the border all the way up to Mississauga. So lots of area to cover. And it's mostly, you're basically looking at ducks and gulls and things like that. So we have an upcoming outing actually this week, Reptiles and Amphibians of Hamilton. And this is co-led with Ontario Nature. You get to learn about reptiles and amphibians of Hamilton and how you can contribute to their conservation through a guided hike at Sheila Dundooley Nature Sanctuary. That's one of our sanctuaries. And at this event, you will learn about reptile and amphibian ecology, habitat conservation, and at least 2 community science projects led by Ontario Nature. And so if you want to join in that, there's just some registration required. So you'll have to go to hamiltonnature.org and take a look at the calendar, and there'll be a link there. And our next general meeting, so this is the bird study group meeting. There's also a general meeting which covers nature in general, not just birds. Our next one is Queer Ecology, a celebration of human and non-human diversity. So naturalist May Mitchum is doing a talk on queer ecology where she'll highlight a few of the plants and animals that challenge heteronormativity and the sex binary. Learn how some frogs and wildflowers can change sexes, discover same-sex bird couples that raise young together, and prepare to have your assumptions challenged about the natural world. So that's here on November 10th. And next month's bird study speaker will be James Lees. He's going to be talking about his recent trip to Falkland Islands with his family. And basically he accompanied his father and a couple of friends to the Falkland Islands, and they started in Oxfordshire and flew there, apparently almost 13,000 kilometers. That's quite a flight. But it's famous for its rugged landscape and penguins, and James is going to give us a wonderful presentation on that. I'm sure it's starting to be a theme in November, I guess, because last year in November we had the Brazil presentation, so so that'll be really fun. All right, so tonight's speaker will be, and he'll be coming up here shortly, Steve Burrows. He is the author of the Birder Murder Mysteries, and he's going to take a lighthearted look of his path from birder and environmental journalist to author and bestseller. So I'd like to welcome him up here, and we'll just take a minute to switch slides. All right, so you should be able to just tap left and right. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you, Rob. Thank you very much for inviting me tonight. I was saying earlier on, I've been doing this for a long time now, and I've lost count of the number of talks I've given in Ontario, but I've never managed to land here in Hamilton before. So I've kind of been east and west and south and.
Let's see, that's our live stream thing.
Oh, okay. We better put that back on. The live stream.
Yeah, we'll put that back on.
Okay, we're all good. So, apologies for that. So, I was watching the presentation just, and it seems to me my own area would fall in that sort of third remit of the study group, which is to bring what was it? Average people, I think was the wording you used, and expert birders into the same realm. I wouldn't say I qualify on either score there, but I certainly am someone who's operating outside the birding circle, the conventional birding circles for a lot of the nature groups. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that I get invited to these different groups, because I'm able to speak from, I am a birder, I'm an avid birder, but I also work in this other realm of literature, and that gives me the opportunity to kind of spread the word about birds and birding to the unconverted, shall we say. So we're going to begin tonight's journey through my own journey through coming from journalism to writing murder mysteries featuring birds, and it's going to be did I get this right? No. Oh, here we go. All right. So, researching and writing the Birder Murder Mysteries. The story begins in a place called Mai Po Nature Reserve in Hong Kong, a really small reserve on the northern edge of the New Territories, and it's a really important stopover area. It's on the East Asian Flyway, and so it's a really important stopover area for migrating birds coming from Australasia up to Siberia and then back down that corridor. And annual birds that we were likely to see there were... Are you sneaking in first?
Keep going. It's okay.
Okay.
You don't need to be anywhere near that close.
Okay. We good at that?
Yeah, we're good there.
Okay. All right. So annual birds we're likely to see were spoon-billed sandpiper, but the one that was the key bird there was the black-faced spoonbill. And at the time I started studying this, which was many years ago when I lived in Hong Kong, 25% of the world population of black-faced spoonbills would overwinter in Maipo marshes. But it's a conservation area different to that which we're used to in North America. It is right on the shores of Shenzhen, which is the biggest industrialized area in southern China. And you can see that from the proximity there, any sort of stochastic event or air pollution or a spill into the waterways could seriously affect the bird populations and indeed threaten the existence of the black-faced spoonbills there. So I thought this was important enough to kind of draw attention to the local community who were not really birders at the time. So I wrote an article for a magazine called Asian Geographic to highlight the fact that all of this critical population of black-faced spoonbills was overwintering in Maipo, and that it was such a precarious existence for them. I sent it into a magazine called Asian Geographic, and they really enjoyed it. They said that they were happy to do this. But the thing that appealed to them probably most of all was that the photographs were taken by somebody called Risa Burrows. Now, I should say at this point that Risa Burrows, my wife, sitting at the back there, she's the one who put this PowerPoint together. So I said to her, now this section here is kind of important because it leads to the next part. So we need to know that people get the point that you took the photos. So she said, yeah, I can do that. I can make sure people get that. And then she said, just in case they miss it. I said, I think they probably got it. And she said, well, you never know. They might just miss it. So in case anybody missed the point, Risa Burrows took the photographs for that article. And Asian Geographic love this because typically when they have a journalist go out and cover a story, and most magazines are this way, they will then dispatch a photographer. If the journalist doesn't do photography themselves, they'll dispatch a photographer to go and try and get images that match up to the text. And that can be really problematic. You could have different climatic conditions, different seasons. Some of the principals may not even be around, and certainly the wildlife are unlikely to cooperate, and give you the images that you've spoken about in the text. But in this case, Risa was right next to me as I was doing the research and out in the field and talking to the principals. So she was able to get images that matched exactly with the text that I was writing. So we were able to deliver this entire package to Asian Geographic and kind of take away a big headache for them. And as I say, they were really enthusiastic about this. So enthusiastic, in fact, that they said, hey, would you like to be a field editor for Asian Geographic? And I said, oh, I'd love to be a field editor for Asian Geographic. I said, what is a field editor? And they said, well, basically what a field editor does is goes out into the field, chooses their own stories, covers them, and in this case with Risa, delivers the images as well, the entire package, and you send it in, and you don't need any editorial pre-approval for the stories. Once we have them, we'll put them on in the list, and we'll find a publication space in a forthcoming issue. So this was a fantastic opportunity for us, fantastic. And we traveled all around Southeast Asia, choosing our own stories, going there and covering them. We went to Thailand and looked at the gibbons. We went to Papua New Guinea and studied the bird-winged butterflies. That particular specimen is 9 inches in wingspan. And we went to the Philippines and looked at seahorses. But occasionally we would come across a story, and we knew it was a good story, and we decided we were going to pursue it. But we knew that it wouldn't match the Asian Geographic remit, and so we were prepared for this. It just wasn't a fit for the magazine, but if it was a good enough story, we would follow it anyway. And one of those stories led to the next stage in my journey towards writing fiction. The story in question involved the cormorant fishers on the Li River in southern China. And these days, it's typically done in the lower reaches, I think, for tourism. They'll take a tour boat out, they'll go to the raft, tourists will get their photographs, they'll go home. But in the upper reaches, in the hinterland, it's still practiced as a way of fishing for the markets. And the idea is that the cormorants go out on the raft with the fisher, and they are fitted with a ring around their neck. And they are, as we know, cormorants are consummate fishers, so they dive in, they fish, as this one is doing here. They come back to the raft, but because of this ring, they can't swallow the fish, so they regurgitate it into the basket, and then at the end of the day, it goes off to market. So that, as I say, this has been going on for centuries, this practice. But the story that we came across was about a guy called Mr. Lee who had aspirations of something greater. Mr. Lee had decided that he wanted to get himself a white cormorant. Now, this would be the equivalent of getting the Lamborghini on this stretch of the river. It was going to raise his status, and he was going to be the big man in town. So Mr. Lee went ahead and he got himself this white cormorant, but he had a problem. And the problem was that this white cormorant would go out every day on the raft, and it would dive in and it would catch the fish, but it was only catching fish small enough to go down inside the ring. So every day the white cormorant would come back with a full belly, contribute nothing to the communal basket. And Mr. Lee was slowly losing his mind. Cormorants have really oily flesh, which makes them great swimmers, but makes them really unpalatable. So he couldn't kill this bird and eat it, although it was non-productive. And because there are costs associated with raising one of these birds, he couldn't trade it or give it away. And its reputation was such up and down the river as a non-producing bird. He was simply stuck with this white cormorant. He couldn't do anything with it, and it was contributing nothing to his income. So, while this was bad news for Mr. Lee, it was pretty good news for us because we had a good story going here. But as I say, we knew, even as we were covering it, this was not an Asian Geographic story. This was not going to go for the magazine. But fortunately, right around this time, BBC Wildlife magazine was running a contest. And again, more of Reese's wizardry here. This is Winning Words. It was called the Year's Best Nature Writers. So I wrote up this story about the unfortunate Mr. Lee and his white cormorant, and I sent it in to BBC Wildlife, and it won one of the awards for Nature Writer of the Year for that year. So, as a writer, this sort of affirmation is your lifeblood, right? If people show you they want to read what you have written, that's all you need to hear. And I said to Risa, hey, you know, people have read this narrative of mine and they're interested. Perhaps it's time to make that step and write this novel that I've been promising myself I would always write. So they tell you, as a beginning writer, to write what you know. And I knew a little bit about birds, and I knew quite a bit about murder mysteries because I was an avid fan of the Masterpiece Theatre and the PBS and all of those things, the Poirot and Inspector Lewis. So I thought, you know what, I could maybe blend those two things and see what we could come up with. But I was aware that in starting to write a novel that I was going to intend for mainstream fiction that was going to feature birds, I might be running up against some headwinds. I think it's fair to say that birding in the wider community of reading and in the public in general is not universally well received. I don't know how many of you saw this in USA Today. Creepiness is linked to men, clowns, and bird watching, they said. And Risa, I'll save you the trouble of getting up to point out that I qualify on all three counts here. But there are some really obvious reasons why you could understand that. I mean, the idea that birders might perhaps be seen as being a little obsessive. I've never found that to be the case myself. But of course, it's this idea that wherever we go, we have these bins, we're watching, we're looking, we're searching things out. But the more I played around with this idea of a bird watcher and a detective, the more commonalities I found, and I decided I may have something plausible to work with. Both disciplines rely on careful observation, attention to detail, and deductive reasoning to an extent. The difference being, of course, that with birds, the suspect is present, and we use empirical observations to what did we see, what did we hear, how's it behaving. And of course, in a crime, in most cases, the suspect is absent, and you're going to be using inferential clues and evidence as a detective. But certainly there is a common truth to both, which is that when you've eliminated the impossible, as Sherlock Holmes reminds us, whatever remains must be the truth. So if you see that bird and you've eliminated all the things that it couldn't be, what you're left with is what it is. So I thought, you know what, I've got something here. I've got the basis of a character who could be a birder and a detective, and we can work with this. So I built on that. So now I've got my character worked out. Now I'm going to look for a setting. And originally I wanted to set it in Canada. I wanted it to be a Canadian novel, but the more I looked at it, wherever I decided to set it, it was going to be a regional novel. It was either going to be a Maritimes novel or the prairies or the mountains, the Rockies, but I couldn't get something that was universally Canadian. I suggest it might not be possible. Certainly isn't possible for me. So I decided to go back to what I'd originally wanted to do, which is to set it in an English seaside village, to have that murder mystery setting from that enclosed, encapsulated little village. But I was going to have a Canadian detective. So I had a Canadian detective, and I was going to translocate him to the British east coast of the seaside. So I needed a location that actually existed on which to base this fictional location that I was going to come up with. And right around this time, it was my birthday, and my mother-in-law sent me a book called 50 Places to Go Birding, but it was the subtitle that caught my eye. Before You Die. So I thought, I'm always nice to her when she phones. I know what this is, this implied threat, but I thought, anyway, probably better get a move on here and actually, get on with this if we're going to go. So one of the places in the book was a place called Cley next the sea. Not next to, but Cley next the sea in Norfolk on the east coast of the UK. And one of the things that particularly appealed to me when I started researching it was, if you ask people in southern Ontario for birding hotspots, they could probably readily give you 6, 7, 8, the Peely, Rondeau, obviously Van Wagner's Beach, Carden, Prince Edward County, a couple of others, but there'd be a standard set of small ones. If you ask the question of North Norfolk, hey, where are the birding hotspots? This is the answer you get. So for me, this was really, really appealing, because if I'm going to set a book there, I don't have to keep going back to the same spots, the same locations for different parts of the action. I can set some action here, set some over there, and I've got a huge diversity of landscapes, from forest to marshland, coastland, hills, cliffsides. So this was really appealing to me, and the more I looked at it in Cley, we went over there, Risa and I, and we drove around. It had the high-hedged country lanes, the little 18th century timbered buildings, and the village squares. And I thought, this is really fitting exactly what I'm looking for these books, exactly. So I'm pretty circumspect about my writing. I never share it with anybody. The first time Risa or anybody else ever sees it is when it comes out in print. Until that point, it's me and the editor, and that's it. So I'm really, really, as I say, circumspect about it. But Risa's a little more outgoing. She's a little more gregarious. So we're in this pub in Cley the night before we're supposed to come home, and the guy says, next table, he said, "Hey, you're not from these parts, are you, love?" And Risa said, No, we're over here because my husband's researching this area. He's going to set a murder mystery here. It's to do with birds. And the guy said, "Oh, well, you must have heard about St. Margaret's Church then." And I said, "No, I haven't heard about St. Margaret's Church." So he proceeded to tell us the story of St. Margaret's Church. It's a 14th century church, and right in Cley, or the nave is 14th century. And one day, about 10 years before we got there, a bird arrived in the gardens of St. Margaret's Church in Cley, and it created quite a stir. And it was this bird. Now, as I say, I do a lot of talks for non-birders, so I kind of have to explain that this is obviously a white-crowned sparrow. We don't get too excited in North America because the last count I saw was breeding populations in 60 million or so. But in Britain, in Norfolk especially, there hadn't been a white-crowned sparrow up here in a generation. So this bird was creating a lot of interest. And every day in the small lane outside St. Margaret's Church, we had scenes like this. And because the bird was sedentary, it was there, and it was for a couple of months, it didn't move from that garden. People who'd never seen a white-crowned sparrow could invest in a journey with a very strong expectation that they were going to be able to see this bird and add it to their life list. So people were coming from the Netherlands and from Norway and France and Scotland and Ireland, and they were flooding there, and they were all rewarded with this sighting of this fabulous bird. But the birders were aware that they were creating quite a bit of disruption, in this tiny little lane with all of these people. So as a way of thanking the locals for their hospitality and apologizing for all the disruption, they set down a little bucket and they started throwing loose change into it every day, whoever was there. But because the bird was there for so long and attracted so many people, they were able to collect over $10,000 in donations. Now, as you may be aware or understand, a church that old is in need of church repairs constantly, and this church was no exception. So they took this $10,000 and they put it towards some restoration work in the church. And in the UK, for the past 1,000 years, they've had a particular way of honouring benefactors for churches, be they kings or local nobles, landowners, whoever it might be. They would always acknowledge their contribution to the church and honour them in a particular way, and they continued the tradition in this case, and they enshrined that little bird in stained glass. And if you go there today, St. Margaret's Church, the eastern apse, there's a window and there's that little bird there. So the guy told us this story, and I looked at Reese and said, we're done. This is the place. We're going to be setting, I'm going to call it Salt Marsh, but it's going to be based on Cley. So now we come back, and I have a character that I'm happy with. I have a setting. I've got the rudiments of a plot going on. I'm thinking I'm going to overlay this idea of the mystery and the birding, and I'm going to have what I'm going to call myself a birder murder mystery. So I set out to write this. I wrote it and did it all, and I had no contract, I had no publisher, I had no commission to do this. I wrote it completely on spec, and I sent it in. And it's what's called an unsolicited manuscript if you send it in. And there are very few publishers that will accept them, but I was lucky enough to find one that did. So I sent it in, and I kind of expected the standard response to unsolicited manuscripts, which is to say, "Dear contributor, thank you for submitting your story to our magazine. To save time, we're enclosing 2 rejection slips. One for this story and one for the next story." But in this case, in fact, that didn't happen. They phoned up and they said, "Hey, maybe we got something here." So we went down, we chatted, we got a contract going, and we ended up producing a book called A Siege of Bitterns. And I think it's fair to say that nobody knew how it was going to go, this idea of this murder mystery and birder combination. But in fact, it did quite well. It won the Crime Writers of Canada Best First Novel Award. And it was one of the Globe and Mail's top 100 books of the year selection. And publishers have a fairly predictable way of responding to this sort of notice. So they came back and said, "Hey, you want to do 2 more?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll do 2 more." So now I've got a wonderful problem, which is I've got to come up with 2 more stories, but I've also got what was a successful formula, and I want to kind of keep to that to the extent that I can. And it's going to feature a particular bird that I can focus on, and it's got some charisma that I can use. But it's also got an environmental theme that I want to develop and look at, and this becomes a stronger and stronger part of the stories as they go on. So in the first novel, the environmental theme was to do with wind power and the disruptions of these wind farms. For the second book I produced, I called A Pitying of Doves, and what I featured there was the idea of species reintroduction. I chose a bird called the Socorro dove that is in fact extinct in the wild, but they are rehabilitating Socorro Island in Mexico, off the coast of Mexico, in order to reintroduce these birds from captive populations they have. And for the third book, I chose A Cast of Falcons, and that was going to be about the illegal wildlife trade with birds being taken from the wild for the hunting trade in particular. And I chose the white gyrfalcon. Well, I chose the gyrfalcon, but it's a white gyrfalcon as the kind of iconic bird for that. So I wrote those and I got them out there. And while this was happening, the UK took notice of the books, and they decided they wanted to produce their own edition. So they said, we'll have a go at this. So they put it out. And once again, we weren't sure how it would be received in Britain, but once again, it was received really well. The Times really liked the books, and the Daily Mail really liked the books. And so, again, with this kind of notice, other publishers have a pretty predictable reaction, and it wasn't long before the US came a knocking and said, hey, we wouldn't mind getting in on this action. We'll keep the same covers, but that's what we want. So I said, this is great. But something really interesting happened right around this time. So without too much of a spoiler, the part of the plot of A Siege of Bitterns revolves around the idea that a bird called an American bittern may have shown up in Norfolk on the east coast of the UK. And it's very sketchy, and the records aren't right, the recording isn't right. It's all very nebulous, and we're not sure, but it's a possibility for part of the book that this American bittern may have shown up on the east coast of Great Britain. And so the US publication date for the Siege of Bitterns was April the 5th, 2018. And exactly 1 week later, on April the 12th, an American bittern shows up on the east coast of Britain for the first time. I got friends phoning me up going, how'd you do that? Just call me the bird whisperer, baby. But there was another really interesting thing that really looked like it was going to pay off big time, and I was so excited about this. Because the books were coming out in Canada first, and then the other editions were coming out later, they could take reviews from the early ones, and they could put them on the covers of the forthcoming editions. So, for example, the first one here, Cast of Falcons, they had, for example, suspenseful, well-crafted mystery, which is what somebody had said earlier on. And I thought, oh, this is going to drive sales through the roof here. I'm going to be I'm going to be looking for a mansion on Bridlewood somewhere. So the first three books, I'd gone through the first three seasons of birding in the UK, and I was kind of spreading things a little bit, but still predominantly in the UK. And now I found myself with the fourth book, and if I was going to follow that pattern, I was going to be looking at winter. And although we know winter birding does offer opportunities, but they are limited. And so I thought, what I might do now is take this winter birding in Britain, and it's locked in this cold, harsh winter environment, and juxtapose it with a tropical setting, so we can have it bouncing back and forth, and we could have a little more birding going on elsewhere and open things up a little bit. So I decided to go to Colombia, and I decided I was going to focus on hummingbirds as the key family, to kind of make a statement that, hey, this book's not about the birds in Britain, because there are no hummingbirds in Britain, right? So I went down there and I said to Andreas, who's the guide, I told him what I was doing. I said, I need to kind of focus on hummingbirds here, so I'm hoping you can find me some. And he said, I think I got you covered, Steve. So I was just talking to Neil earlier on, he's got me beat, by the way. But in 17 days, I saw 50 species of hummingbird. And the group I was with saw 54 in total. Things such as the violet-tailed sylph, and the black-tailed train bearer, and the green-bearded helmet crest, and the booted racquet-tail, these wonderful, wonderful, wonderful birds. So I'm getting all the hummingbird material I need, all the research, that's all going great. The environmental theme I decided I wanted to cover in this case was to do with deforestation in the UK, as opposed to what I'd learned were intact forests in Colombia. And I said to Andreas, how is it that Colombia, this beautiful country, has managed to keep so many areas of this forest intact and pristine over all these years, when everywhere else in the world is having such trouble? And he said, oh, well, there's a simple reason for that. These areas were the strongholds of the FARC rebels. They just got out of a 50-year conflict with the government. And the upland forests were where the FARC rebels held out, and these were absolute no-go areas for anybody. So there's no roads, no logging, no industry, no visiting. They were completely sealed off. And so for 50 years, they'd been virtually untouched, these forests. And now there's still these beautiful tracts of untouched forest. So what we had here, which I thought was really interesting, was this idea of this accidental conservation through conflict. So this terrible situation, this terrible history that the country had suffered, had managed to produce at least something good on the conservation level. So I had what I thought was a pretty good, setup for a story, and the idea was I was going to stay down there and get all my notes together and write these things up, and then have a pretty workable manuscript to come back and finish off. And so every day, Risa didn't come with me, so every day I'd be down there and I'd get a call and she'd say, how's it going? I say, oh, I'm working hard. It's going well, but man, it's tough. And then my friend sent her this picture. And so I got a call and she said, you were supposed to be working down there. Or at the very least, you're supposed to be watching birds and looking at birds. I said, hey, I'll have you know, just today I was looking at toucans. So I ended up producing a book called Shimmer of Hummingbirds. The Canadian edition's on the left and the international edition's on the right. And once again, we got this thing where they're taking the review from the Canadian edition and putting it on the cover of the other one, and now it's going like it's a tremendous whodunit. And I'm thinking, oh, how long can it be before I have my own island in the Caribbean? It's just a matter of time before this happens. So having gone to that really tropical setting for book 4, I switched gears a little bit for book 5 and decided to set part of the action here. And this is a place called the Broomway. And the reason I chose it is because it's the deadliest path in Britain. Dun, dun, dun. So what I was actually looking to do here as the environmental theme was to examine invasive species. And I decided on 2. There's a plant there called Japanese knotweed, which is so pervasive, many people will be familiar with it, so pervasive that people have actually walked away from properties they had because it was simply not feasible to remove the knotweed. It's got such a hole, it would have been so prohibitively expensive that they just had to abandon their properties and walk away. Huge, huge problem, Japanese knotweed. The other interesting invasive that I found that they dealt with there was this one, our friend the ruddy duck. And they had decided that this was an invasive species, and they had an extirpation program in place where they were actually paying people to shoot these ducks. And there are still a few ruddy ducks in the UK, but the birders won't tell anybody where they are now. But there aren't very many. They were largely successful in eradicating ruddy ducks from the UK because they felt that they were, as I say, this invasive. So I looked at those 2 and I played with those 2 ideas and built that up, and I produced a book called a tiding of magpies. Again, we have the Canadian edition on the left and the international on the right. On your right, that's correct. And this is where the captions on the front started to go a little awry, right? Because Audubon said, intertwines avians with the classic whodunit in a completely original way. Now, my grandsons will tell you that I cook pancakes in a completely original way, and this is by no means a compliment. So I thought, you know what, maybe they're hedging their bets a little bit here, and they're not full on, not as full-throated in their endorsement, but that's okay, we'll see what happens next. So I'm now at book 6, and there's a following now in North America, in the US. So we have discussions with the publisher, and they said, you should think about bringing some of the action back to North America. You know, leave, obviously, a main part of it in the UK, but bring something back to North America. And I thought about this, and I love this idea, but I thought I want it to be a plausible storyline, which is not having him jump on a plane and go to Cape May, and then, you know, jump on another plane and he's in San Diego, and then he's in Acadia, then he's up in, I don't know, Grasslands National Park. There's got to be some sort of reason for him to be here doing these things, or the character that I'm going to put in here. And what I wanted was some sort of unifying theme that would allow me to check off a whole range of landscapes in North America. And I thought the best way to do this is probably to have it be following a migration route. And the ideal candidate for a North American migration route are these guys, whooping cranes. Because the whooping crane migration, as many of you will probably know, they overwinter in Aransas in Texas, and then they fly the entire length of the continent, coming up through the Midwest and through the prairie states, to end up in Wood Buffalo National Park in the Northwest Territories, which is where they breed. So this was if I could kind of weave a narrative where somebody was going to follow these birds or track them in some way on their migration route, I'd have a plausible storyline for them to go all the way up through the States and up through Canada. And it would be, give me the opportunity to talk about different places on the way through. So that's what I decided to do. And so Reese and I jumped on a plane. We went down to Aransas. And we weren't obviously going to track the birds. That was, obviously impossible. We were lucky enough to see a couple of really late whooping cranes in Aransas, so we're just ready to leave on that route. But the idea was I was going to go to the different staging places that they stopped at on their way up on their migration, and then I could create a fiction and create a storyline based on these areas. So we started to drive up through, and we went up through White Sands, and we went up through Quivira in Kansas. And we started to approach a place called Kearney, Nebraska, which a few whooping cranes will stop at every year, but it's the major staging post for sandhill cranes in North America, coming up through that central section. And Reese is a photographer, as we know, and she's kind of avid. So we're driving up, and I said, Reese, I don't want you to get your hopes up here when we get to Kearney, because we're a little late in the season. I'm pretty sure all of the cranes are going to have gone through, so just, temper your expectations here. I don't think you're going to see any birds. I think it's just going to be talking about the landscape. So as we get towards Kearney, Nebraska, we see one or two cranes. And by the time we get to the Platte River, there are 450,000 cranes sitting on the islands in the Platte River. And what had happened was, this season, the first wave had come in, but there was an extreme cold front all over the top of Canada, right where they're going to be heading for. And so instead of pushing on, they decided to stay and wait for the weather to break. The next wave had come in and stacked up with them, and again waited, and then another wave. So as I say, virtually, I think it was something like 80% of the sandhill cranes in North America at the time were all stuck in this one area. And Reese is going crazy, taking photographs all over the place, and she said, I'm just in awe of your knowledge of bird life. So she had to go back. At that point, she had to come back to Toronto. She said if she had to spend another day in the car with me, there would definitely be a bird murdered. There just wouldn't be any mystery about it. No, I think we had grandchildren duty or something. So I pushed on alone and went on up to the Northwest Territories. And this is the typical habitat that the whooping cranes are going to be heading for to breed in Wood Buffalo National Park. Now, I don't know if anybody here has been to Wood Buffalo National Park. I imagine one or two may have. This is a seriously, seriously large piece of territory. I don't have a map of Hamilton, but this is Durham region right there. So I'll give you some idea of the scope of this place. It's immense. I'd got this plan that I was going to go into the park and just, paddle down through the river there and maybe set up on that little beach right in the middle there and camp for a couple of days and absorb the atmosphere and get all the inspiration I needed to write this out. But Mother Nature had other ideas. When I got there, I was there for 6 days and the temperature never got above -15, day or night. And it completely shut down the park. And but I still had to go in every day to do distances to make sure what was a plausible distance to travel and the landscape, the topography and whatever. So I would stop by the park office every morning and tell them, and they said to me, Steve, this park is the size of Switzerland. And as far as our records show, you are the only person in there today. I said, so please don't go off your designated route because we don't want to have to come and try and find you. So every night I would come back and I would check into the park office and tell them, I'm back, and it was all good. But what this had done, this cold snap, it had driven all of the people out of the park into Fort Smith. And so instead of having to track them down in the park, I could just go from restaurant to cafe along Fort Smith, and there aren't very many. And I could find all of the principals I needed to talk to. The guy who flew the rescue missions, the person who did the kayak work, the local indigenous leaders, the park people. Everybody was there in this one small stretch of road, and I could do interview, and they had nothing else to do other than sit and drink coffee and talk to me. So I got more research done in 4 days than I would have got in 4 weeks if I'd have been chasing them around the park. So it was fabulous. And I came back and I produced a book called A Dance of Cranes. And this is the Canadian cover, just lovely, very happy with it. I was struck by the original picture that Risa took, the similarities, and it was just a coincidence. But when we got to the North American and international cover, this is where the problems began. In the first place, I think you could say some of the enthusiasm had waned. for 375 pages, entertaining. But of greater concern to me was the fact that the bird on the cover was a crane with a black neck. And that's because this was a black-necked crane. So I phoned up the publisher and I said, hey, Jenny, the bird on that cover, it's a black-necked crane. I said, it's a lovely bird, but it's like the national bird of Bhutan. It's not the bird that should be on the cover, which should be a whooping crane. And apparently there's a long story as to why it happened, but she said, I don't think anybody's going to notice, are they? And I said, well, I'll tell you one group who might notice, because I'm going to get on a plane tomorrow and I'm going down to Colorado to speak to the Yampa Valley Crane Festival, which is sponsored by the International Crane Federation. And I said, and all of the world's leading crane experts are going to be in that audience. So I go down there and, predictably, like I go for dinner the first night, first question, ladies and is there any significance to having a black-necked crane on the cover of the book? And I said, no, really there isn't. And then I give the talk the next day, full crowd, lovely. First question from the crowd, I'm wondering why there's a black-necked crane. Here's my publisher's email address, ask her. But anyway, so for now, we got over it, and the book did quite well. We had a lot of fun with it. So now I'm on book 7, and I'm thinking, 7th book, 7th continent, right? So I've got this idea for a story that's going to involve these research stations in Antarctica. So I phoned my publisher, because if they green light it, then any research I do is approved and it's tax deductible, right? So I phoned the publisher and I run through it, and she said, okay, let me see if I have this right. She said, there's going to be a murder in Antarctica. And I said, that's correct. And she said, and there's going to be no witnesses, no clues, and no evidence. I said, that's correct. And she said, and your detective is going to solve it from 12,000 miles away in the UK. And I said, that's correct. And she said, well, that ought to be worth reading. I've got my green light, here we go. So I jump on a plane and I go down to Ushuaia, and I get on anybody been to Antarctica? Yeah, so you know about the Drake Passage, right? The 2 personalities of the Drake Passage, the Drake Lake or the Drake Shake. And we got the Drake Shake. We got those 4 or 5 meter waves bouncing us around, but it was fabulous. And then once it calmed down, it was wonderful, and we got to see all the things you'd want to see. One thing I discovered, though, is that there's not a lot of good literature out there to help you with Antarctic birds. There aren't many species, but I wanted to know as much as I could. Penguin is one. So I thought, I'm going to go online here and see if I can get some help. It may come as a shock to you to know that the internet is not entirely reliable when it comes to stuff. For example, I see things like this. Piper Kerr, that's the one on the right. So at least I know what a penguin doesn't look like. So I thought, oh man, I'm in trouble here. So anyway, I went down there. We did get to see penguins. It was wonderful. I do think some of the penguins may have seen one too many tourist cameras, though. If this little gent is not posing for a picture, I don't know what is. But the bird that I wanted to see down there, that I kind of was going to feature as one of the birds that's going to be one of the keystone pieces in the story, was a bird called the snow petrel. And I didn't get a chance to see it, and I was watching every day. They said your best chances is on the ice floes, so I was out there every day looking, never did see it. And then we were in the Zodiac, just about to approach the peninsula to set foot on the 7th continent, and I see it fly overhead. And I'm looking at it, and the guides in both the other Zodiacs know that I'm looking. Steve, there's your bird. So I think I'm probably the only person who's ever approached that Antarctic peninsula and been looking up instead of looking at the land. But I did get to see my bird, a gorgeous, gorgeous bird. So it was, the trip was already wonderful, but it kind of was the capper for it. So I decided to write the book. I got the book. And all of the titles of my books are collective nouns for families of birds. And up to this point, they've been fairly, Dance of Cranes, Cast of Falcons, been fairly good. So I get to petrels, and there isn't a collective noun. I look everywhere, and there isn't one. So I'm discussing this issue with my son-in-law, and he says, oh, you mean a collective, you mean like a flock of seagulls? And I said, oh, there's no such bird as a seagull. Gulls and their cultural. But Jim, he's a wonderful human being, my son-in-law, but he's not to be outdone, right? So in the 80s, and many of us can speak in this country, there was an indie rock band called A Flock of Seagulls, right? So they were doing this retro tour in southern Ontario, and Jim went to see him. Now, the second book in the series, A Pitying of Doves, is dedicated to my 3 grandsons, his 3 sons, right? So Jim went to see them, the band, and for Christmas that year, he bought me A Pitying of Doves signed by a flock of seagulls. So that year, we always have this competition about gifts. This year, he was the outright winner. So petrels are associated with ill fortune, misfortune, because they come in ahead of storms. So the old sailors used to see the petrels and they'd know that they were in trouble. Those winds were coming, the high waves and stuff were coming. So they got this reputation of being birds that were going to bring ill fortune, as I say. So there was no collective, so I thought about this, and I had one of my characters, Lindy, come up with the idea of calling the collective a foreboding of petrels. And as I say, at the time there was no collective. Since this came out, I've now seen this on the internet a couple of times in different forums and stuff. So it seems like one of my characters has introduced this collective to the English language. So well done, Lindy. I'm very proud of you. The other thing you'll notice here, though, is that they have now completely given up on this idea. And my lovely wife could see how devastated I was by this and how saddened for this turn of events. She said, "It's okay, I'll write one for you." Thank you, Risa. Get you right here. It's originated. Okay, so I'm about to write book 8. I'm about to get started on book 8. And I get a call instead from a company called Adventure Canada. I don't know if anybody's familiar with them. They do the small ship excursions to the north, to the Arctic, inside Passage, Greenland and Iceland. So they said, hey, would you like to join us and be the onboard naturalist for our circumnavigation of Iceland? And I said, are you kidding? I would love that. Wow. So I, got ready to join the ship at Reykjavik and fly up there. Did a lot of research on the birds up there. Again, there aren't too many species, but I wanted to be sure I knew what I was talking about when I was on there. And I was all ready to go, and I was particularly interested in introducing them to birds such as the Iceland gull, so called because it breeds exclusively in Greenland. Come on, guys, you're birders, you know how this works, right? But the first question I got kind of threw me a little bit. We landed the Westman Islands on the far side, and we got off. And the question I got was, hey, why are these little birds attacking us all the time? And so I had to explain to them that those little birds were Arctic terns, and the reason they were attacking them is because they take every year a 44,000 kilometer annual migration, the longest known of any species, and this kind of figure-8 pattern. So they overwinter in Antarctica, and then they come up to the Arctic to breed. And I said, if I'd flown 22,000 kilometers one way to find a nice, remote, isolated, deserted beach to nest, and then all these people started disembarking from Zodiacs and stomping right through the middle of my breeding grounds, I might be angry enough to attack you guys as well. But we worked it out how we were going to do it, and we managed to work around, and then they became really, really engaged with these little birds. So it was a great story to share with them. But of course, the key species that everybody wanted to see in Iceland were puffins, right? And we did get to see them, got some lovely views of them. And the collective noun for puffins is a circus of puffins, which, let me tell you, has some connotations that I might be thinking about. I'm not making any guarantees here, but it's in the back of my mind here. A circus of puffins. So I finished Iceland, and they said, hey, that went okay. Do you want to stay on and do the trip to Greenland with us as well? And I said, this is like my dream life. I can't believe this. Tell me again, my job is to lean on the rail of a ship and point out birds to people. So I said, yeah, I'll do that. So I joined them for the Greenland trip. And this is me doing my thing in one of the Zodiacs. You're not going to recognize this individual from this picture, but you might recognize her from this picture. So Margaret Atwood was on board, and I'm fortunate enough to have become friends with Margaret over a few years now. I just emailed her not long ago and said, would you be okay if I wrote this? And I sent it, and she said, yeah, it's fine. So now I can call her my BFF. my BFF. But we were on board, and I don't know if I've probably got time to tell this. So anyway, Yeah, I got time, right? How are we doing for time? Yeah, okay. So we're on board the ship, and they want me to do. They want me to offer a set of books, signed books, for the auction for BirdLife International for the fundraiser. And I said, I'll be happy to do that. So I go into the ship's bookstore, and there's none of my books in there. They're all sold out, right? But there are a lot of, Handmaid's Tale and all the rest of the stuff in there. So I come back the next night and I say to the assembled group, look, I am perfectly willing to do this. I'd love to donate a set of books for this auction. I said, but I'm going to have to send them, get your information, whoever the winning bidder is, and I have to get your information, and then I'll send them to you from home. I said, because there's none of my books left here in the bookstore. I said, but there are other authors on board who haven't sold out at all, so there's their books. So I get the dagger look from Margaret. And we go back, and she writes, the next night is the poetry slam. And she stands up, and I just get skewered by this limerick. So the smart thing to do would be just to retire gracefully and lick my wounds and, step into the shadows. But I didn't get where I am today by being smart. So I wrote a riposte to this and posted it. And then I got a response from her saying, I'm currently working through a book of Shakespearean insults. I shall get back to you shortly. So this is how it's going. And on I think there's a website thing, on the website it recounts what went on there. But one of the great things I was able to share was the story of the thick-billed mure. And I don't know how many of you are aware of this. In Prince Leopold Island, in Lancaster Sound, these birds nest, and then at about 3 weeks after fledging, the young birds jump off the cliff in Prince Leopold and hit the water, and they can't fly at all yet. And as soon as they do that, the male bird flies down and lands within a couple of, maybe a meter of them, 2 meters of them. And together, those two make the journey from Prince Leopold Island or Lancaster Sound right the way through to the Labrador Sea, where they overwinter. And that male bird never leaves the chick's side in that entire time. And it's one of the most wonderful sights you can see, is all these little birds swimming in the water and the males right next to them, protecting them. And the reason that the timing is what it is, that they must leave before the chicks can fly, is because at Baffin Bay, at the very edge there, by the end of October, it starts to freeze up. And because the birds can't fly, if they can't get out and swim past it before the ice sets in, they're going to get trapped there and they'll never get down to their wintering grounds. So the females stay in the nesting areas for a little bit longer, and then they fly directly to those grounds, and they reunite as a family when the chick and the male gets there. And they're, tens of thousands of birds. So absolutely wonderful story. I'd heard about it, I'd read about it, I'd seen videos. To actually see these birds swimming past the ship and the pairs, it was just a really heartwarming thing. One of the real highlights of the Greenland trip. Absolutely loved it. So now it's time to get on with book 8, and I used to live in Asia, we used to live in Hong Kong for a while, and I was always struck by the juxtaposition of this uber-technical society, the cutting edge of so many developments in terms of technology, and this bucolic, almost 19th century existence of just farmland and rural life, and this tension between the two. And I thought it would be nice to try and play that off in a book with the two different areas. So for the technical side of the story, I chose Singapore. And Singapore doesn't have many good birding areas, a very small area. It doesn't have many good natural birding areas. It has Sungai Buloh and Bukit Timah is the forest area, but it doesn't have a lot of natural open spaces. But what it does have is Asia's largest bird park with some fantastic species in there and some great settings, beautiful setting. So I was able to use that for part of the story. But for the bucolic side of things, the more sedate area, I decided to go to Bhutan. So it should say, welcome to the kingdom of Bhutan. And there, I met a guy called Dr. Rinzin Dorji, and he was the guy who was going to be setting up my tour of Bhutan. And again, you couldn't make this stuff up, right? So we go for dinner on the first night there, and he's got a copy of this book on his desk. And he said, I can't tell you how pleased we are that you put the black-necked crane on the cover. And I said, I do have a little bit of influence with my publishers, you know. He said, we're so thrilled. He said, these birds are just now coming in from the Tibetan Plateau to the Popjika Valley. He said, so we're going to make, you know, to honor this thing that you've done, we're going to take you on a special trip out there to see them. So the next day we headed out to the Popjika Valley, and indeed the black-necked cranes are all there. It's a wonderful, wonderful sight. But that wasn't the bird that I was going to feature in this 8th book. That bird is found in the silver fir forests at elevations of about 4,000 feet. This is the Dokula Pass, and there should be 7, if you count them, there's 7 peaks of the Himalayas there from there. But in the silver fir forests, there's a bird that many consider to be one of the most beautiful birds in the world. And it was the bird that I was going to try and feature as part of the key bird in the book. And it's the bird called the Himalayan monal, also called the 9-colored pheasant. I didn't take this photograph. I never did see one flying and displaying like this. I just saw this kind of shape moving through. But, you know, birders, we know it counts as a look. So I got my information. I came back and I produced a book called A Nye of Pheasants. And again, there's no comment on it this time. I'm taking no chances this time. I'm writing my own copy. So the publisher said, yeah, we'll work on something else, I think, Steve. So now I finished that, and now I'm moving on to book 9. So we're almost caught up with what's going on. And book 9, A Deceit of Lapwings. The research for this one, it's always great, but the research for this one was fabulous, because one of the great things about what I do is that I get to speak to experts in so many different fields. And in this case, it was just astonishing, the people I was able to speak to. I'd come up with this idea that there was going to be this research facility, and it was going to look at birds and populations and movements and migrations from 3 different perspectives. From an aerial perspective, and from space, and then from like an aerial perspective just flying over the terrain, and then from the terrain itself. And then we're going to have these 3 different perspectives on migrations. So I did a little bit of research, and I found that there was actually a program already doing something very similar to this. I'd come up with it independently, but I thought, you know what, I better run this by the person who's running this, because I don't want to think I'm just kind of pirating it from him. So I managed to get in touch with the person who was running it, who happened to be Dr. Roberta Bondar. And again, one of the great things about doing this and having kind of this outreach to all these people is people in surprising areas know about the books. So I phoned her up and said, oh yeah, I know about those books. Yeah, coming down for a chat. So I went down, and she couldn't have been more helpful. She gave me all sorts of information. In particular, she gave me some perspectives of what it's like to look at the Earth from space. And it was magic. And often when you do research, it's not the big things. You can get the big things online. It's the small nuggets, the little details, the phrasing they use sometimes, the experiences, the expressions, the emotions they underwent. So those were the things that I drew from her in that, and it was really fabulous. But there was no place to put Dr. Roberta Bondar or anybody like her in the book, but I featured the research. But another area of research that I came across was something called eDNA, environmental DNA, which is where it's now possible to collect particles of DNA through air filters and identify species from that particle of DNA that's trapped in an air filter or something like that. It can be done. And the world's leading expert on that is a lady called Dr. Elizabeth Clare, who's at York University. So I phoned her up and I said, hey, I'd love to talk to you about this stuff, this eDNA you're doing. And she said, yeah, I wondered how long it'd be before one of you mystery guys phoned up. She said, I can tell you, you can't identify an individual human being from the DNA sample you're going to get in this. She said, so I'm sorry to disappoint you, but if that was your plan for your plot, it's not going to work. And I said, well, I read that it wasn't possible. I read it on your website. I said, but I think I've got another workaround that might work for that. And she said, all right, come on up and we'll have a chat. So I came up. She turns out to be unbelievably enthusiastic. She loves all this stuff. She's right into it. She came to the book launch and she posted this on her website when the book came out. So I didn't feature her as her, but I featured her under another name in the book, which she contributed the name. It was her aunt, I think. So she was all over this. She absolutely loved this idea. So now, and then I got interviewed by York University, because I'm an alumnus of York, and we had this whole other area and stuff. And so we've become really good friends, and just from doing this. And she's just an amazing individual. Very, very enthusiastic, a lot of fun. So she's in the book, but she's not in the book as herself. But a person who is in the book under his own name is a guy called Clifford Cox. And you won't recognize the name probably, but if you've ever used a credit card or you've ever made an internet transaction, Clifford Cox is the guy you have to thank for this. And again, I've just got a couple of minutes. I'm almost at the end, but I do want to tell this story if I can. So Clifford Cox came out of Cambridge and joined GCHQ, which is the British Secret Service, their technical department, their listening devices and all the technical stuff. And he joined them as a young man in the very early 70s. And the very first week he was there, they took him around and they said, this room here, yeah, we're working on this thing. We're looking for this end-to-end encryption, so you could kind of send a message and somebody else could decrypt it at the other end without you having to send them the key and stuff. And they said, we've been working on it for years and we can't get anywhere with it. So he went home that night, and because it's British Secret Service, you're not allowed to write anything down when you're outside their hours, right? But they can't stop you thinking. So he came back in the next day and he said to the guy, you know the problem you got? I think I've solved it. And indeed he had. He'd come up with the idea of end-to-end encryption to be able to send internet messages when that came out, to do credit card transactions, all that stuff. But the thing is, he worked for British Secret Service, and they said, thanks, Cliff, we're going to hold on to this for a bit. So in 1975, two American researchers called Diffie and Hellman independently came up with the same system, and they were under no restrictions, so they released it, and they became global superstars in computer technology. They won the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for computer science for their work here. And all the time, Clifford Cox is sitting there thinking, I actually did that a few years ago, that's me. So I found his information some obscure place, and I sent him a note, and I thought, well, this is, go nowhere. The next day, I get an email back from Cliff, and he said, this sounds interesting, your book. He said, let's talk more about this. So we go back and forth, and he asked me, how did you get my email address? And I told him, and he said, okay, can I ask you not to share that with anybody? And that address is now gone. It's no longer on the internet. So he was, for a long time, the head of GCHQ, the British Secret Service branch. And so he's talking to me about all this stuff that went on, because it's part of what goes on in the book. And I said, that must have been awful for you to be sitting there knowing that you had created this and then sitting there unable to say anything because of the Official Secrets Act, and then watching somebody else get all this acclaim and this glory. And he said, well, I think if you were looking for the global spotlight and international fame, then a career in the British Secret Service probably isn't for you in the first place. So incredibly modest guy, wonderful guy, and helped out a lot. And I said, would you mind if I mentioned your name in the book? And he said, no, that sounds great, we'll do that. So you'll find in the book, you'll actually find Clifford Cox in there. So we're very close to the end now, it's at book 9. Just to quickly announce that I just signed a contract for 3, well not just, but I've signed a contract for 3 new murder mysteries. The 10th one, I should be submitting the manuscript on November 15th. We'll see how that goes. We're pretty close. Depends who's asking, right? If the publisher say, oh, you're kidding, couple of commas, we're done. So that one will be going out, and then there'll be one next year, and then one the year after that. And finally, I always like to acknowledge Zeiss. I'm what's called a Zeiss field naturalist, and they make a lot of what I do possible in terms of travel and stuff. I lead beginner birding groups around. And again, as going back to what I said at the beginning, there are 1 million people, probably everybody in this room could do the birding side better than I could do it. But what they like, Zeiss, I think, is that I bring in people who may not be birders at all, people who are mystery readers or just readers in general, who just want to come and listen to this, and then hopefully will say, you know what, that birding thing, that don't sound too bad, I might give that a try. So Zeiss are hoping I can kind of spread that message a little bit. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my presentation. So thank you so much. I think we might have a minute or two for questions. I don't know. We do? Yeah. We got there's a question down the front.
Yes. So basically, yeah, all these birds sound fascinating. I've been doing my own basically work with counting birds and stuff like that. How does one young person achieve a feel this kind of stuff, not just for birds, but fish or the environment in general, basically. You know what I'm saying? Achieve a career in something like that. You know what I'm saying?
I do. I think. Yeah. Are you asking how to write about them? You mean?
Yeah. Basically, how to pursue a career. Basically, writing. I do writing as well. Basically. Yeah.
Okay. So the question I think everybody heard was how a young person might begin a career writing towards this. My suggestion would be to write even if you don't have a publisher or anywhere to have it published. If you come up with a good story or a good article or something that's of interest, write it as if you were going to send it into a magazine. So do the best job you can in terms of research and looking at it, do it properly. And even if it never gets published, it's like a practice run, if you will. And then if you keep on doing that, keep on sending it out, you will eventually, somebody will say, yeah, this is work that we can use, and it's well written enough that we want to be able to publish it. So one of the kind of simple adages that I like to say is that you never fail until you stop trying, right? So you just keep...
Appeared in the wood duck in an unrelated topic, basically, that kind of stuff already, basically, and I'm looking to basically publish the article on the bird count, basically, in the wood duck soon, basically.
Okay, yeah, that's wonderful. If you can get things published, anything you get published adds to your legitimacy, and then the next time you go out to somewhere else, Canadian Geographic, whatever it might be, you can say, I've already been published, my work's already appeared in these publications. That really helps, yeah. Great question, thank you.
I'm just curious, did they get the right pheasant on the cover of your pheasant book?
Yeah, they did get the right pheasant on the cover of the pheasant book, yeah. Apparently, what happened was the Cranes book came out during COVID, and and I think it's true. There's no reason not to be. But they sent an email to me, and I think we all remember those times were really fractious when nobody knew what was going on. Apparently, they sent an email to me with 2 attachments. One was the text for the back cover, and the other was supposedly the front cover image. But I only ever got one. I only ever got that back cover copy. So I sent it back and said, yeah, this looks good to me. And then they said, well, you approved it. And I said, I really don't think I did. It's not likely I would, but that's what happened, yeah. Great question. Other questions? No? Okay. Well, thank you so much for...
Actually, yeah, on behalf of the Naturalist Club, thank you again for presenting. Anybody who would like to have follow-up questions after, I believe you'll be here for a little bit.
Yeah, we'll be outside if anybody wants to pop by and say hello. And thanks again for inviting me. It's been absolutely wonderful to be here tonight. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.